Hey everyone, in today's video I'll be showing you how I built, painted, and weathered my 1/35th scale Panzer 35T. I'll also be making a simple diorama and add two little figures for it too. This video is going to be a bit longer than usual, so sit back, relax, and watch the show. By the way, I fixed my mic, so I hope I can bring to you better audio this time. Let's start things off with an unboxing. As you can see, this Pz.Kpfw 35T from Academy Plastic Models has some nice box art. Inside, the parts are nicely detailed and the number of parts is reasonable. Instructions are rather clear, and the kit also came with some decals. Now onto the building process. I first cut the plastic parts off the sprue and then sanded the uneven parts with a hobby knife and some sandpaper. Next, I just simply glued the pieces together. As for the wheels, I want the rubber tires to be slightly damaged. To achieve this effect, I scratched the sides with a metal sanding tool and cut out deeper cracks with a hobby knife. And to achieve the look of damaged fenders, I slightly heated the plastic part up and then used metal pliers to bend the plastic. And here is the tank build-up. Note that all the wheels are still removable and not glued yet. I also went ahead and built the two figures included in the kit. As for stowage, I used parts from Tamiya's Allied Vehicles accessory set and German fuel drum set. To improve the bags, I added straps to them, as you can see now. All I needed to do was to stick a sheet of masking tape on some aluminum foil and then cut them into strips. Next, I superglued them together. Now onto the painting process. I'm priming the model with MIG's white primer using an airbrush. The smaller pieces were taped onto a cardboard box and painted separately. Matte black from MIG Ammo is also painted on along with some acrylic thinner to achieve a pre-shading effect. Note that you should paint multiple thin layers to achieve an even paint job. Now I'm painting the tank in German gray. This layer is also best painted in thin, even layers. And here is the result. As for highlights, I'm using gray highlight for the brightest parts along with some gray base for the transitions. You'll need a piece of paper of some sort to block off places you don't want your highlights. And here is the result. The figures also need to be coated in some white primer. Finally, the last thing we need to paint on is matte varnish, which is used to protect the paint job for our upcoming steps. 3 layers painted with an interval of 15 minutes should be enough. Can you guess what the next step is? That's right, it's decal application. Things you'll need are your decals, a small plate to hold water, some water, tweezers, a cotton swab, and MIG's decal set and decal fix. After cutting out the decals individually, You can soak them in tap water for a few minutes or until they come off the decal sheet naturally. As you can see here, the decals have come off their decal sheet naturally, and that's when they're ready to be stuck onto the model. When you've got the decal in the desired position, use the cotton swab to remove the excess water. And when that's done, you can directly apply MIG's decal set onto the decal. Repeat this process for all the other decals. "15 minutes later, you can apply MIG's decal fix. And here is the result. Moving on to painting the details, I'll be using matte black, gray base, acrylic thinner for the tires. I used these three colors in a ratio of 3 parts black, 2 parts gray, and 5 parts thinner. The same paint can also be used to paint other details like the shovel and pickaxe. As for the wooden parts, I used new wood for the base and rust tracks for the wood grains. My method is simple and effective. You first apply a layer of new wood, then you take some rust tracks and paint them on the edges of your tool or handle part. Finally, you take a dry brush and gently drag the rust tracks paint across the part. This produces a wood grain-like texture. Now we're moving on to washes. I'll be using only oil paints for this step. All you'll need are brown and black, as well as some enamel thinner, preferably odorless. This paint mixture here is one I mixed up using these three materials. This mixture needs to be very thin in order to flow around details nicely. Now, I am applying this mixture around edges and details to enhance them and to create a dirty look. It's okay to go a little heavy now, as we can simply wipe off the excess or smoothen the effect with our thinner. And when the paint is dry to the touch, we can use a cotton swab dampened with our thinner to soften the edges. And here is the result. Now for more weathering in the form of oil dots. I'll be using blue and yellow oil paints. You'll need a tissue and thinner for this step too. All I need to do is to make some random spots using these two colors and then blend them in using enamel thinner. These colors are used specifically for German gray. You'll need different colors for different camos. White paint can also be used to create more highlights. And this is the result. It's time for chipping. I'll be using gray highlights for the first layer of chips. You'll also need tweezers and a sponge, as well as some tissue to dab off the excess paint from the sponge. Keep dabbing the paint off until you barely see any more coming off. This is when you can apply small random chips onto your vehicle. For the second chipping layer, I'll be using MIG's chipping color and a very fine brush. This time, we'll be using the previous layer as a guide to where we should paint. Locate the more used places on the tank and paint inside the chips of the previous layer. The next step in weathering is to apply a rust wash on top of the rust we just created. I'll be using MIG's streaking rust effects directly from the bottle. The excess can be faded away using thinner or by wiping it off using a cotton swab. Now I'm weathering the lower hull. I'll be doing that by creating my own mixture using plaster, real dirt, and some static grass. The brown grass was simply cut from rope. The wet ingredients we'll need are white glue and MIG's acrylic mud for dioramas. I find MIG's paste to have overly large particles in it, so it's not really good for small scale models. I'd use it for dioramas instead. Anyway, after you mix the dry ingredients together, you can add a small amount of white glue and acrylic mud into the mixture. Mix well and your muddy paste is done. Next, I'll be using a fine brush to apply the paste onto the lower hole, as well as using tap water to blend in the edges. And here is the result. The same process will be done to the tracks. And when that's done, I used the same mixture but thinned down and speckled on using a brush and cotton swab. To make some parts of the mud look wet, I used oil paints of the colors black, brown, turquoise to achieve a dark, wet mud color. This paint then needs to be thinned to a wash-like consistency. And here is the result. Moving on to the exhaust. This will be split into a couple steps. For the first step, we'll need to apply gray highlights with a sponge to create a chipped-like base for our next step. For step 2, we'll be doing the same thing except with chipping paint. Following that, we'll need to speckle on some of MIG's streaking rust effects. Following that, we'll need to use some matte black and some acrylic thinner, and apply it on places where grease and grime would accumulate. Now on to painting the stowage. The bags will be painted in Rosetta Green, Diorama Base, and Diorama Highlight. add highlights onto the bags, I simply added white paint to the base paint of the bag and dry brushed it on. And here is the result. This bag here will have some sort of camo on it, which includes Rosetta Green. The bag also consists of a color called Choco Brown. I then used chipping paint to paint the leather straps around the bags. This tow cable here will be rubbed with gunmetal pigment and then chipped with chipping pigment and streaking rust effects. The spare tracks will be painted in black paint and then chipped with chipping paint and pigment. And here is the tank nearly completed. As you can see here, I went ahead and painted the figures off camera. I'm no expert in figure painting, so I'll leave the figure painting tutorials to other YouTubers. The last weathering step needed for the tank is a black wash. I'll be using MIG's PLW Black Night. This will be applied to all the stowage as to create shadows. Following that, I'll be using odorless enamel thinner to blend in the excess. Now that the tank model is completed, we can move on to the Diorama Base. For the frame, I used a cheap picture frame called Yelevad from IKEA. I chose this because it was cheap and it was a suitable size. This frame came with a piece of paper and a piece of cardboard. I recommend taking out the paper as it will create folds when it gets wet, so don't follow me here and leave it in. For the dirt base, I'll be creating it using real dirt I collected in a nearby park. And a couple of spoonfuls of plaster powder. And finally, some white glue. I found out that by using white glue instead of water, the solidification process can slow down significantly. You can add some extra water if you think your paste is too thick. Give this mixture a good mix and your paste is done. Oh yeah, one more ingredient. That's Mig's acrylic mud. I used this because I wanted the color of dry earth and its thick texture. In the case that you're still not satisfied with the color of the paste, you can simply add any water-based paint into it to achieve your desired color. I used poster color as I had it just lying around. Before we can apply the paste on, we first need to protect the edges using masking tape. The application process is pretty simple. Just spread it on like peanut butter. And here is the result. Our next step will be static grass application. The grass I'll be using is a mixture of yellowish green and green grass. As for the glue, it's Ballast Bond Liquid Adhesive from Deluxe. This grass was then applied by pinching it in clumps. Next, I sprinkled on some dirt with some glue. After that, we want the tank to be sunken into the ground, so we'll need to apply some wet mud paste under the tracks. And here is the nearly completed diorama. The fences were cut from chopsticks, and the wires were cut from, well, electrical wires. The copper wires need to be painted in gray base. And to make the wires look more rusted, I added MIG's streaking rust effects. Our last step in this entire build is to add Europe Earth pigment to the ground to enhance the contrast and add places with dry dirt. And that about wraps it up for this build. I want to thank you for staying till this point. I hope I taught you some new methods in model making that were cheap and simple, yet were still of good quality. This project took me quite a long time to finish, so it would be amazing if you could like this video and subscribe. Leave a comment if you have anything to suggest. I'll be doing more videos like this in the future, hopefully more frequently. Stay safe and keep modeling. Here is a completed model.